Today, we're going to dig into the historic Reformed Christian view on divorce and remarriage. Now, this is a theological framework that's been debated for centuries, and it offers a very, very specific answer to some of life's toughest questions. So let's break down what it actually says and, why it says it.
So, what's the big question at the heart of all this? Is marriage this unbreakable, lifelong bond no matter what? Or does the Bible actually allow for some very specific, God-given exceptions? And that tension, right there, that's what this whole theological framework is trying to solve.
Before we can even touch the exceptions, we have to start with a foundational rule. And in this view, marriage isn't just a contract. It's what's called a divine covenant. Think of a covenant as this incredibly solemn, binding promise, not just between two people, but with God as a witness and really a party to the whole deal. And it's meant to be permanent. This right here, this is the bedrock principle. The key idea is that God himself is the one forming the union, which just elevates it to a whole different level than some simple human agreement. You can see how this sets an incredibly high bar for ever ending that union. And this is where we get that famous quote from the book of Matthew, with Jesus himself reaffirming the original design. The concept you really have to grasp here is one flesh. It's this idea of a union so profound that it's seen as creating a single new entity by God. So you can see why separating it would be a deeply serious matter. Okay, so if the ideal is this permanent, unbreakable bond, then why does divorce even exist within this whole system of thought? Well, the answer really gets into this clash between the divine ideal and, the messy reality of the world we actually live in. And it's really interesting how they frame this, right? Divorce isn't seen as part of God's original perfect plan at all. Nope. Instead, it's viewed as a concession, a provision that's allowed not because it's a good thing, but only because of human sinfulness, what the text calls the hardness of your hearts. And this is where things get really serious. The rule is incredibly strict. If you dissolve a marriage for any reason outside of these two specific exceptions, and then you go and remarry, that act is considered adultery. I mean, that puts a massive weight on this whole decision. So what is that first narrow exception? Well, it's probably the one you've heard of, the most well-known reason for divorce in the Christian tradition. And it all boils down to one little Greek word. And that word is porneia. Now, this is super important because it's a broader term than just the single act of adultery. It can cover a whole range of sexual sins that are all seen as a fundamental violation of that exclusive one-flesh union that's supposed to define the marriage covenant. So check out the key text here from Matthew. The logic, and you gotta follow this, is that an act of porneia is so serious, it has already broken the one-flesh bond. The divorce in this view isn't what breaks the marriage. It's just the legal recognition that the bond has already been totally severed by that unfaithful act. Okay, so that's infidelity. But what about the second exception? This one's a bit different. It's not about cheating. It's about total and complete abandonment. Yeah, they call it willful desertion. And the idea here is that one person just completely bails on the marriage. They physically leave, they refuse to live as a spouse, they just abandon all their duties from the covenant. And we're not talking about a temporary separation here. This is a complete and final abandonment. So where does this idea come from? Well, it comes from the Apostle Paul. He's talking about a specific situation where a spouse who isn't a Christian leaves a spouse who is. And the key phrase here, the one everything hinges on, is not enslaved. Theologians in this tradition interpret that to mean the believer who's been abandoned is no longer bound or enslaved to the marriage covenant. They're free. Okay, so let's just put these two side by side for a second so it's super clear. You have sexual immorality, which breaks the bond from the inside, and then you have willful desertion, which breaks it by just total abandonment from the outside. And according to this framework, these are the only two legitimate paths to divorce. That's it. All right, so we've got these two big ideas from the Bible, but how did they become, like, the official rule book for a huge chunk of the church? Let's trace that path, from idea to doctrine. It's actually a pretty logical process when you break it down. You start with the raw biblical principles, the teachings of Jesus and Paul. Then the smart folks, the theologians, they chew on those ideas for a long time to figure out the exact scope of the exceptions. And finally, those interpretations get locked in or codified into formal church doctrines that are called confessions. And for the Reformed tradition, the big one, the main document, is the Westminster Confession of Faith. This was written way back in the 1640s, during this time of massive political and religious drama in England, and it went on to become the doctrinal standard for Presbyterians and a bunch of other Reformed churches all over the world. And if you look at the actual words from the Confession, what do you see? It's a direct mirror of those two biblical exceptions we just talked about. It names adultery and willful desertion as the only sufficient causes. And notice that extra little detail. The desertion has to be something that can't be fixed. Not by the church, not by the government. It's final. So, what happens next? What's the end result? Well, according to the Confession, after a legitimate divorce on one of these two grounds, the innocent party is completely free to remarry. And get this, the language they use is just wow. It's as if the offending party were dead. I mean, that signifies a total, final, absolute end to that original covenant. All right, we have covered a lot of ground here. Let's pull this all together and just nail down the core takeaway from this entire theological framework. So, here's the whole thing in a nutshell. It all starts with a very high view of marriage as a divine thing, a covenant. The ideal is always permanence, but it accepts that human sin makes divorce a tragic reality. It then strictly limits the reasons for it to just two covenant-breaking actions, sexual immorality and irreversible desertion. And one final key point. This is never seen as just a private decision. It's something that has to involve the oversight of the church and even civil authorities. And all of this leaves us with a really big question. Right? A question for you to think about. This framework was put into words centuries ago. So how does its very strict two-exception structure apply to the huge range of complex marital issues we face today? Everything from abuse to just plain incompatibility. Now that is a question that theologians and church leaders are still wrestling with.